Jeffrey Monaghan has been studying a controversial topic, and that is the policing of Indigenous peoples and populations and movements. And it's an interesting topic. Let me let you speak for yourself, Jeffrey. Why did you choose this topic? There's lots of waste, inefficiency, and mismanagement in public admin, as you know. Why this topic?
Well, it's always topical. It's not necessarily a new topic, but my co-author and I, Angie Crosby, we kind of got into researching and studying the specifics of policing of Indigenous movements. And one of the key themes of the book is that, of course, it's not necessarily a new topic. Indigenous movements and Indigenous communities have arguably been over-policed for a long time in Canada. What is new and what we kind of track in the book is specifically how the architecture of the War on Terror, in various ways. So in terms of resources, but also in terms of the language that the War on Terror uses in terms of extremism and critical infrastructure protection, these kind of key themes of the War on Terror have kind of gradually gravitated away from ideas of Al-Qaeda and militant Islam and all of these different kind of things we think about when we think about terrorism, and have kind of gravitated towards everyday good old-fashioned policing, and have grown into the practices of policing Indigenous movements, which is a key theme of the book.
Well, isn't that also the good old-fashioned topic of mission creep? When you give any government agency some authority, there's a tendency to use it in new and different and expanded ways.
Absolutely. So, you know, some of these themes and the way that we look and try and make sense of all of these developments have all kinds of prior examples. So mission creep in terms of policing and community policing in the 1980s and the 1990s, of kind of expanding into all kinds of different domains, is a very similar and in some ways really informs the ways in which policing agencies look at Indigenous communities nowadays. The one kind of novel aspect of it all is that it is the lexicon and the resources of the War on Terror that are being kind of put towards contemporary policing. And I would say maybe a second novelty that's not exclusive to Indigenous communities, but it is really the kind of rapid acceleration of surveillance technologies and capacities that the police have nowadays that are also being implemented and used in not necessarily new ways, but in ways that have kind of accelerated or accentuated these policing techniques for kind of the contemporary moment.
Now, I think I hear two topics there, and let me see if I've caught up with you mentally. I'm forgetting it's now the roaring 20s in a brand new century, but going back to World War I, would you also say that there has been a tendency to implement legislation and measures and methods that have been a little draconian during times of crisis, such as world wars and terrorism, and then we never fully back off them when times get a little more reasonable? A little residue of those extra powers remains. Is that your take as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of, you know, a lot of the legal architecture that was put in place after September 11th, like the Anti-Terrorism Act, in some ways, you know, I think the Anti-Terrorism Act doesn't necessarily impact directly onto the policing of Indigenous movements, but I completely agree with you. The Anti-Terrorism Act was kind of brought in after, you know, the attacks of September 11th. And in some ways, it's been kind of honed and refined in all kinds of different ways. I would argue that most of that impacts mostly Muslim communities and not necessarily the Indigenous communities in terms of the criminal law aspects. So yeah, I think these are really powerful legal architectures that have been put in place in the last 20 years. And a lot of what we look at is a bit more of the grit, a bit more of the policing practices that happen that aren't necessarily animated directly by changes in legal infrastructure, but have kind of percolated down in terms of the policing practices, policy practices in different ways that, like you're saying, have really become quite normal. They've developed over this last 20-year period, and now in terms of those policing practices and the resources and the capacities that are there on the ground, they're all embedded, and they all, you know, 20 years ago might not have seemed normal, but now they absolutely do seem like normal practices.
Now, one more big umbrella concept before we get into the, as you call it, nitty-gritty, but you were saying that existing technology is being used in new and different ways. And let me see if you've stimulated an example. Photo radar, red light cameras, security cameras in shopping malls and so on. All of a sudden, we learned with the Boston bomber and with events in London that there is a picture of you and I doing all kinds of things every moment of the day. It would be pretty easy to track our events. And if you happen to use a handheld device, the data here tells somebody where I've been all day, and the data can be suspicious, even though the person shouldn't be under suspicion. Have I got that right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think the real advance in all of these different components where data is being accumulated, whether it's a CCTV camera, radar, fingerprints, internet tracking technologies, all of these different things can also be integrated too. So what we're really at the cusp of in various ways, and the book doesn't actually necessarily get much depth in terms of the integration of what's happening in all kinds of different spheres when we talk about integrating databases and integrating data points. The moment we're in, we're actually in a really kind of innovative period of time where policing agencies in particular want to make all of these different connections to be able to not necessarily just produce evidence like a photo radar or a CCTV camera, but to be able to use all of these data points in all kinds of innovative ways to be able to practice and kind of intervene on the future, to act against crimes or transgressions before they happen, which is perhaps, again, a bit of the novelty, right? We've definitely been kind of using all kinds of different tracking technologies for a long time, but we're using them differently, which is one of the themes.
Fantastically interesting topic and of concern to all of us. But after all, the book is called Policing Indigenous Movements, and you start with a secret program called Sitka. Explain that, please.
Yeah, well, Sitka was something that Andy and I ran into when we were kind of researching the book more broadly. And what Sitka was a super innovative and, in some ways deeply troubling program that was a year-long investigation. That it was centered in the RCMP. And what Sitka was it was an effort to aggregate all kinds of data on prominent activists from various databanks. So what the RCMP did, and this was kind of managed by the national security bureaucracy of the RCMP, is they reached out to all their departments, they reached out to some private actors, they reached out to other policing partners and agencies, and they said, listen, go back in your databanks, whatever your different databanks are, go back to 2010, give us the prominent activists that are related to Indigenous rights movements or campaigns that you know. So this spanned all kinds of stuff from the Olympics to all kinds of extractive type things, I don't know more, specific campaigns, stuff like murdered and missing Indigenous women campaigns, all kinds of stuff that kind of interconnected Indigenous issues. And they said, give us your prominent activists and give us your files on all of these activists. So all these
wait a minute, you've got me a little hot under the collar here already, because why would someone, activist, lawyer, academic, or otherwise, a concerned citizen, who wanted to get to the bottom of a crime, the murdered and missing Indigenous girls and women, why would that person be under any sort of suspicion? That person is a citizen coming forward with information of use to the police. Well, what's the problem there?
Yeah, well, I think that's the big question. So I think, one of the interesting things that Sitka and the program and the kind of final report that comes out of Sitka, it really does show the depths of information that's being collected in various policing databanks. So there's a huge time period. It's from 2010 to 2015, and it's all kinds of non-criminal issues that's aggregated in these databanks. A lot of it is social media type stuff. Some of it is more classified documents that's in police databanks, and they're able to kind of go back into these databanks, whether it was criminal or non-criminal, but a whole bunch of non-criminal, like you're saying, type of events, and all kinds of data have been aggregated and put in these databanks. So the rightness and wrongness is a major question of what ends up going in those databanks. In principle, there's privacy regulations about the retention of personal data and stuff like that. And obviously that's not necessarily being followed, and that data is not being deleted. But the fact of the matter is, these movements, in some ways, and if you want to kind of read into it, these movements are certainly in some ways trying to say, listen, there's crime happening and we're trying to help you with that. But they're also questioning the RCMP. So in all kinds of different contexts, the RCMP is in this position where they're being criticized, they're being scrutinized in all kinds of different ways. And what we can see kind of through these data banks is that their response to that is treating these movements, these criticisms, these campaigns, these kind of public demands as forms of expression that deserve scrutiny, that should be data banked, that should be monitored, and that they should have some kind of attention towards.
Now, ironically, in those RCMP databanks, folklore has it, would be the name Pierre Elliott Trudeau as a subversive, under watch, maybe even forbidden to go to the United States because of his union activism in the asbestos strike.
Okay.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it?
Yeah, well, some of these things, like you're saying, aren't necessarily new, right? This is a little bit of the past repeating itself. And certainly, a lot of this has to do with politics. And I think there's a long history of people pointing out that the RCMP has had what Steve Hewitt and his co-author Seth call in a recent book called Just Watch Us, they call it the red-tinged prism. And that the RCMP and police culture in the RCMP have had an internal bias, a police culture that's antagonistic towards leftist movements in particular, and various forms of movements that question or criticize the RCMP, and because of that scrutiny, they end up being themselves suspects of further surveillance.
Now, I don't want to make every one of my questions a gosh, shucks kind of a question, but in the history of activism, Jane Jacobs helped stop the Spadina Expressway. The Women, W-I-M-I-N, movement in Vancouver had a large impact on early childhood education and so on, and a lot of activism dealt with the environmental movement, and a lot of good has happened, and we have freedom of expression, and it's supposed to be the clash of ideas, out comes a better idea. Are you saying that Indigenous activism in particular has been targeted?
That's certainly the argument that we make in the book, and I think that there's been, on one hand, these practices aren't new. On another hand, on another kind of level, one of the arguments that we make, the intensification of these campaigns, is directly related to resource extraction. So there is a centrality in terms of the emphasis on which campaigns and which kinds of disruptions and who's a greater threat, certainly from the Sitka type documents, that all point towards resource extraction and campaigns that threaten resource extraction as deserving more scrutiny and inviting all of these kind of labels of criminality and all these different things. So that's a central argument that we make, and I think there's also an important historical parallel to that, is that if you look at something like Idle No More and the influence of Idle No More, and perhaps if we can kind of think about how the history books are going to represent Idle No More in 20 or 30 years, I think we're going to see similar conversations to our conversation today about the women's movement or the environmental movement, where Idle No More was absolutely central in talking about nation-to-nation relations and talking about decolonization and bringing Indigenous rights and sovereignty back into an equation that I think is going to radically transform Canadian politics. I think it's transforming Canadian politics right now, and the legacy, I think, will probably put our historical moment right now in a similar type of perspective.
Well, for those watching who might just say, oh, well, look, this is the 21st century and the resource sector is where it's at, and anybody wants to get in the way is a pain in the neck. I might turn your own words back on you and say probably one of the largest impediments to unfettered resource development was the Berger inquiry. And Thomas Berger is going to be speaking in Fredericton soon, and maybe he should be targeted. And also the Supreme Court rulings on duty to consult. Maybe the Supreme Court should be under a watchful eye. Do you think they are?
Certainly not, but you never know. I don't know.
Well, it was an ironic question. Tell me about the imaginary anti-petroleum movement. Yeah,
well, that's again one of these kind of fascinating things that we kind of learned about as we're going through the process of research and gathering all these documents that the RCMP are producing about the criminality associated with movements that are challenging extraction. And there ends up being this kind of this language and creation within the RCMP bureaucracy at a certain point of time, maybe late 2000s, early 2010s, where they start talking about the anti-Canadian petroleum movement. So this kind of takes a life of its own. And we kind of focus this, make this a focus point in the group to kind of talk about how the RCMP and police themselves have created this label, and they've created a particular label, and this gives us a little bit of a window into policing culture and to see the antagonisms between the police and those who are being pesky, right? Putting up boycotts, getting on the news, talking about all kinds of problems related to extraction and all these kind of things that end up kind of being fed into this bubble of this umbrella of the anti-Canadian petroleum movement. And of course, the kind of puzzling thing with it all is that there is no such movement itself, right? There's not, if you ask someone from Greenpeace or, any of these local community churches that are having these teach-ins and all these different things that are soliciting attention, they don't call themselves this. They certainly would object to the label itself, but it ends up kind of having a life of its own. And that label has its own life, and it kind of carries through the bureaucracy, and it ends up kind of being an umbrella that various points and anchor points of quasi-criminality or suspicion get hinged to, which of course produces more surveillance, more suspicion, more data banking. So it ends up being a bit of a self-referring justification for the forms of surveillance.
And yet, for real, there has been in this country an anti-lead in gasoline movement that included the petroleum companies who removed the lead, an anti-fluoral, it's been so long I'm not sure I can pronounce it, but the chlorofluorocarbon lobby. We've done a lot of attacking of sources of pollution and won. And yet we still want to use some of those products and use gasoline, perhaps reformed, less more vapor recovery and so on. It's going to take a while for some of these movements to be seen as something that may make a positive contribution, wouldn't you say? And is that even possible?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think some of the kind of climate change campaigning is, over the last couple of decades, I think changed the public perception of climate change in ways that I think are dramatically different if we look at the Kyoto debates from 2 decades ago, where there was people who denied climate change and that, the media would kind of give this two sides of the story of things. So I think the climate campaigning has made, a really positive contribution, at least in identifying the problem. I think where we're at now is we are fundamentally at a lock in terms of how do we substantively address the problem, right? And I think that's all of the levels of government are stuck in this bind where they don't necessarily know how to take the steps that we need to address climate change. And I think the part of where our book kind of gets into this is that part of the argument that we're making is that it's a very specific form of extraction, and the pipeline debate even is really about not so much the kind of gasoline that we need for our cars kind of thing, but it is really about access to foreign markets and expanding the oil sands. So there's this entire other dynamic that Canada is going to have to kind of address in some substantive way, but it's how much do we want our economy to be dependent on the export of natural resources, or do we want to try and diversify our economy and change from being, hewers of wood and choppers of water, or whatever that Harold Innis kind of critique of Canada is basically just an extractivist country.
Now, you may chop water in the Ottawa Valley in the winter, but here in Toronto, we just turn on the tap and it runs out. But I do take your point. And we need a full and open public debate about these topics to come to a decent decision. But lest I leave you and the people watching thinking this is only a clash of philosophical ideas and it'll all right itself in the future, there is this horrible history of the so-called Starlight Ride, where when I was a journalist in Regina, it was still a living memory that Norman Depew, the famous CBC journalist, had made part of his reputation in discovering that the police were taking people out to the outskirts of town and beating them up or worse. And recently in Saskatoon, some Indigenous men were left to die there. Did you look into any of that?
I didn't. So that wasn't necessarily part of our project. And I think there's lots of really amazing research that is being done on those kind of explicit forms of violence. The one tie-in that I would add, especially when it comes to protests, is that part of the implications for Sitka. So that was that specific investigation, and really what's kind of where things are going right now is that there is more and more of this data banking of problematic activists that are happening, and there's more and more of kind of persons of interest and this kind of identification within the policing bureaucracy of the big troublemakers. And one of the really kind of problematic recommendations from Sitka was to have these kind of high risk protesters on a kind of frontline data bank available for officers who are going in to break up disruptions, protests, whatever it is, that would immediately label people who are already in the data bank for potentially non-criminal activities as high risk and volatile. And I think it's incredibly dangerous. It actually goes against a lot of the recommendations from the Ipperwash inquiry that says, you know, if we want to de-escalate, we can't go in to conflictual situations thinking that the other side is violent, is not interested in negotiating, is anti-police, and all of these different things are labeled as high risk and volatile. If police officers do go in to protest situations with the understanding that the other side is volatile and violent, which oftentimes is incorrect, it's being kind of recirculated from bad data, it dramatically increases the likelihood of violence at these interventions, which has gone very poorly for Indigenous people. And what that will end up really meaning, if police officers are acting on these labels, going in and end up engaging in violence, we're going to have a dramatic, 10 steps back in terms of talking about these broader implications of resources, land claims, negotiations with Indigenous people, all these different things. One or two acts of violence at these takedowns could dramatically negatively impact movement going forward. And I think that is unfortunately what these data banks have done. And these various kind of self-fulfilling forms of surveillance, they're really feeding into an on-the-ground antagonism that could really go bad.
Well, and most of the police officers I know want good policing and good technique and good outcomes. And you use the phrase, this has gone very badly for some people. It's gone badly for a lot of people. The Watts riot was initially a traffic stop. So was a riot in Chicago. Grosvenor Square, the battle in Seattle. I mean, you could go through a list of 50 years of kind of off-kilter police techniques, kettling of people so that they can't get out of a mass protest. The Hillsborough soccer crush in the UK that killed 90 people. It was just bad police communication. There wasn't a racial overtone to it, just poor policing. So I hope that this fosters some discussion. It is kind of an echo of an old book called Nobody Said No, and I think it was written by Jeff Sallet, and it was about the RCMP burning a barn in Warden, Quebec, so that the FLQ couldn't have a meeting there. Why did it happen? Nobody said no. Maybe we need some people like you to say no.
Great.
Thanks very much for joining me.
Okay, well, thanks very much for having me.
And, I should really give the last word to you because I interjected so much. Is there anything you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, I really appreciate your conclusions. I think you're absolutely right. And I do think that in the current moment where we do have these kind of standoffs that are happening in BC, there's going to be likely just as much contention around Northern Gateway if it gets off the ground, or Trans Mountain. So you're absolutely right. And I think that the RCMP are in a terrible position where all of a sudden there are clearly reasons for we need political dialogue, and there's a political problem in terms of land claims that has to be addressed, and the RCMP are being kind of dragged in to preemptively try and resolve the problem when the politics have not been properly addressed.
Thanks again.
Yeah, nice talking to you.